way. We'll stop twice at least for questions, but really please use the Q&A function to ask questions as they arise. Strategic litigation is impact litigation. We're doing it to create a lasting precedent impact for it to go beyond this particular case that we're working to help change the legal landscape for our clients. We really don't recommend trying to fly under the radar, particularly because so many judicial processes are public now. You can find about case filings in public records, maybe not in every country in the world, but in a growing number of countries. So every case needs media planning. You need to be prepared for the possibility that it will attract media interest, or the possibility that media interest may be in your best interest and in the best interest of your client and your case, in which case you really want to be proactive about reaching out about it. Sam, do you want to talk a little bit through the potential audiences that cases may have?
Sure. So part of the work we do in media planning and media strategy is thinking about whom we're trying to reach. And that really fits into both the media perspective, but also as we think about communications holistically. Obviously, not everything we do, not every opportunity you have to speak, to engage on behalf of your clients is going to be media. Ultimately, we're trying to understand who are the audiences you're trying to reach sort of down the road, with media as a means to an end. So potential audiences, as we think about our strategy, are the judicial side, judges, juries, as well as the political side, legislators, elected officials, policymakers, other appointed people who are in roles that can affect the future of our clients' cases. We also think about potential clients, right? Like wanting to demonstrate the impact that you all have on behalf of client X can demonstrate to potential client over there down the road in the future, or perhaps a partner, organization, a potential fellow attorney or nonprofit that may work with similar types of clients, that you might be a source for them and a partner. Obviously, there are legal systems at the levels of, local, national, and even international. And all of these are potential audiences that we want to be thinking of as we develop the strategies to reach those audiences, with media sort of in the middle of all of that.
So one of the members of the council, Celinda Gay, wrote a great article that we'll share with you, talking about media strategy. They were perhaps coming from it from a business point of view and doing business litigation, but we think that the principles of the sword and the shield apply. One of the notes that they made is that the days of no comment are over. If you're bringing impact litigation, you're bringing a case more into the public eye and opening it up for media attention and scrutiny. So proactive press strategy as a sword, means that you want to share the client's story first and proactively. And we'll talk a little bit about how this can be done without identifying them specifically, because we know it might be dangerous for your clients to be proactively, completely identified in the press. It can create pressure on government or the defendant or the person answering the suit. And it can garner public support for change. And we've seen as North Americans that a lot of our legal processes go through our Supreme Court process, or at least our federal court process, as a means of changing the law. And even when you lose, as is the case for the reproductive rights movement in the United States, which has definitely been through a year of lost access and lost legal precedent, the public support is really important. And so we've seen an increase in public support for reproductive rights, which have disappeared legally, which means it may not be resolved in the court, but it may be now resolved in the legislature, either of states or our national Congress. So that's just an example of even when you lose, it can be helpful to garner public support. And then a protective press strategy, which is still, I would say, like affirmative. You're going out, you're saying affirmative things about the case. The shield, it affirmatively reaches out to correct the narrative. So if there is a narrative being presented in the case that's negative towards our client or towards what we want to see in terms of the legal precedent or change, we can correct what should be done. And we can tell the story from our point of view, especially if it hasn't been out there before. And then it just gives voice to the client's side of events, which again, may not have been brought out before. So I have a couple of examples, again, that we'll share the links for. I helped run a strategy for this first one last week. This is not a refugee or asylum litigation, but it is a strategic litigation to try and bankrupt a white supremacist extremist group. If you can keep them in court long enough, you might be able to drain their resources and make them less of an impactful domestic terrorism threat. So I worked with the human rights organization that filed on behalf of this Boston man who was attacked by the white supremacist group. Our goal is to get his side of the story out there, to keep this group in court long enough that they, their resources are drained and they can't perpetrate these kind of crimes again, and that they lose power in the American political debate. Two other ones, the biggest actor in North America, I would say, for lawsuits of this kind is the ACLU. And so this CNN piece is an ACLU case where they found an unaccompanied migrant child who was rejected from the opportunity to seek asylum during Title 42, which is this public health law that I'm sure many of you are aware of. And so they found the case, described as a 16-year-old from Guatemala. So they were able to protect his identity and got a federal ruling saying that children should be exempted from this, particularly those traveling alone. And that remained the precedent until the end of Title 42, which happened back in May of this year. And then Hyas, one of our clients at the firm and one of the founding members of the council, saw that there was a movement among certain states to block refugee resettlement, for them to try and opt out of the federal system of refugee resettlement. And so Hyas sued over that and got rid of this idea that states could opt out of refugees being resettled there. So that has held as well and is currently not a threat for refugee resettlement in the United States. And all of these were, I'm hoping this lawsuit filed in Boston last week will be effective to the goal. But these are just some examples of how media has been leveraged in these cases to garner public support, to educate the public. I think there are probably a lot of people outside of those states that were trying to block refugees from being resettled there that had no idea. And so that's why it was great to be on a national outlet like PBS NewsHour talking about Hyas's effort to make sure that any state in the union is available to refugees should it be the most appropriate place for them to resettle. And so these were all opportunities where a proactive story was told. We want to pause for questions right now and just see if there are any with what we've talked about so far.
Bella, are people able to use the Q&A and also talk, or is it just the Q&A just so we can make sure people know how to ask questions?
It's just the Q&A, but they can also raise their hand and I can allow them to talk.
Got it. Okay.
And you should be able to too. I think I'll make you both co-hosts as well.
Great. Yep. Perfect.
But I think you can continue because it doesn't look like there's any questions at this point.
Okay, let's keep going.
Then Sam, I'm going to turn it over to you for protecting clients.
Great.
Oh. All right.
Okay, excellent. So, of course, the work that you all are doing is critical to ensuring that we're protecting the safety and confidentiality of our clients and their cases. And, every case is going to be different. Depending on the phase of the case that you're in, there's going to be different moments where it may become more possible to include people's real identities or tell more about their stories. But obviously, there are still ways, even in early stages or potentially at the end of the process, no matter what the sort of level of confidentiality needed in the case of each of your clients may be, there's still ways to tell their stories and demonstrate their situations and the impact of the legal system on what they're going through. There's still ways to tell those stories in a way that really humanizes your clients. We do typically, in situations where there isn't a legal concern and that sort of thing, we do tell people our advice is to use people's real names, to name your characters when you're talking about people. In your case, you're going to have to refine that a little bit. So whatever may be safe, whether it's initials or first name only, or even, of course, changing people's names and making that clear. The key here is to be honest with members of the media and other target audiences in terms of what the situation may be. So if you are changing someone's name or age or blurring their face in a Zoom conversation, in a Zoom interview, changing their voice, that kind of thing. It's just important to make that very clear so that we're all kind of operating above board and members of the media know whom they're dealing with. Different news outlets have different rules in terms of what sort of level of anonymity and in what situations they're willing to include an anonymous source. And so that can all be sort of understood and negotiated in conversations ahead of a media interview. For you all, it's going to be really important to make sure that before you or your clients say anything, that ground rules are established and that you and the reporter both understand, what is permissible to include and what's not. And this can become a little bit tricky for, those who are newer to dealing with the media. But the main thing to remember is that if you want to set a ground rule, you have a question, about how this reporter is going to use your information, that you ask the question before you reveal the information, if that makes sense. And if people have questions on sort of how that works, we can discuss it in a little bit more depth. But the point is that you're looking for confirmation from the reporter that they understand what you're asking of them in terms of keeping things anonymous or confidential or whatever, before you actually give them any information that they can use. And this may seem like a nuance, though we're talking to a legal community, so it probably less of a nuance than with some of the other types of people that we're training at times. When you're talking about details, again, effective storytelling, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is really about, painting a picture that helps people sort of picture the scene, picture the situation, understand someone's experience. But again, in these situations, we're going to need to be a bit more broad. We don't need to pin down, exactly specific dates. We may not want to talk about specific, very specific, states or provinces or cities or communities, but rather talk about broader frames of reference that are going to resonate, but obviously keep your clients safe by not giving people information that they can go and sort of search and identify and figure out, whom you're talking about if that's not a safe situation. Of course, it's up to you what sorts of images you're sharing with media, knowing that, yes, they will want images, right? Especially in this day and age, people are looking for visuals, right? For as much as we can. But there are ways to take pictures that show, kind of the back of someone's head or a profile, some sort of image that obscures someone's identity and keeps them safe. We've all seen this, particularly on like broadcast TV, that sort of thing. All of that. And just to, reiterate once again that before we share materials with media, again, I feel like this is for you all, this is 101, of course, but before we share materials with members of the media, we need to come to an agreement on how they're going to be used. And sometimes this does, depending on the outlet and sort of the level of seriousness or professionalism of an outlet, sometimes this is a legal contract that gets signed that makes very clear how different pieces of information or visuals that we're giving them are going to be used.
And we'll talk about the ground rules specifically in a slide here in a minute when we talk about how to select media to engage with. All right, so as we said up front, every case needs media planning, whether or not you intend for it to be public or not. An FAQ document is frequently asked questions. This is essential for everyone to come up with as a document as part of your case. It might be even helpful to pull in somebody who isn't as familiar with the case to see what questions they have, maybe a paralegal who's working on a different case, a partner, someone who isn't, involved in the day-to-day, and see what questions they have. What things do they want to know, and how can you answer them in advance? So obviously basic facts of the case, what laws are involved, or what lack of laws are involved, or what laws are being broken. And explaining that. Samantha and I have definitely had our fair share of like really getting into the nitty-gritty. I was working with a opinion editor at CNN where they said, you're claiming that the use of Title 42 here is illegal, and I don't think we can print that. And I said, you and I are going to go look at the US code right now, and I'm going to show you how it's illegal. And so you can cover some of that in your FAQs. Imagining, what questions the average layperson would have, and then what an informed journalist would want to know. And then you can formulate answers that everyone's comfortable with in advance. Samantha mentioned visuals. Work with your clients to approve visuals in advance. Is there a picture of their hometown, their house, maybe, again, them from the back, some sort of something that they brought with them, that they can show holding in their hands that represents where they came from, or their journey, paperwork with certain things blurred out that can sort of demonstrate the enormous burden that they're having to negotiate. This is on you as the legal part of the team, but know the legal risks of talking about things. So my assumption is, as a non-legal professional, that a lot of anything that you say publicly probably is then admissible in your case. So you want to be consistent. You don't want to say anything different from the way you've said it in your legal filings. You can sort of soften language so that's more accessible and less legalese, but make sure that the heart of the fact is the same, and that there's not inconsistencies in what people say. And we'll talk a little bit more how to prepare your client to engage directly with media in a way that serves that as well. A holding statement is like writing a worst case scenario or a just in case scenario document. Let's say, that there is a chance that the case isn't going to be able to go forward and it will be dismissed in the early stages. Write a statement responding to that. That you just hold, you don't send it out until it's necessary. But it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So consider any sort of outcomes for public steps of the case where you might need to respond, and prepare a statement about your response in advance. Determine which channels to use when and who does what. Not all of us have a channel where we're speaking to the public all the time. In fact, we know that channels like Twitter and Facebook are like very much in flux these days, and they're not as reliable as they used to be. Do you have a newsletter? Will you put it on your website? How will you announce things that are announceable? What's the process of who puts things up? Deciding who holds the pen on certain public statements way in advance can be really helpful. And that leads to the last point of having a clear vetting chain for approvals. And we would recommend these be as short as possible, these chains. You should probably not have more than 3 steps. And I can sense that a lot of you are like, oh my gosh, there's at least 12 steps, it has to go all the way from me to the people I'm litigating with, like all the way up to the partner, in my firm or my organization. Try and keep it as short as possible. 2 or 3 steps will allow you to get good oversight, feedback on what you're doing, and get stuff out to the public in a timely manner. Identifying reporters. All right, so let's say you're going to go with your sword approach, where you really want to proactively tell your client's story. You want to be first out the gate. You want to define the narrative in the public as much as possible. One of the best ways to do that is to connect with a reporter who might be interested in helping you tell that story. You don't have to talk to everyone. You can pick and choose. Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about researching reporter targets and the best way, the best practices in identifying people, like how we research reporters?
Sure. Yeah. So especially with the kinds of stories and real life cases that you all are dealing with, we really want to make sure that we're vetting those we're reaching out to. And there's 2 components. There's sort of 2, I guess, like tines of the fork of the ways we deal with media. There's proactive and there's reactive. So proactive is when we're really controlling, and as Meredith says, identifying who are the best possible members of the media out there to tell this story. And the way we do that is researching what they've covered before. Most outlets these days, every reporter has a profile page on that outlet that ideally links to their past coverage. If not, we search. Sometimes we can do that publicly, Google News and public things like that. Sometimes we have to go a little bit deeper through paid databases like LexisNexis News, which we can, people like us can facilitate if you all don't have access to things like that. But the idea is to really go back in time and really look at what a given reporter has, what topics have they covered, so that we understand what level of expertise they have, which is going to dictate sort of how high level or more basic foundational the conversation we're going to have with them. What kind of terms do we think they understand versus are going to need, more definitions, and that sort of thing. What has been their tone, their language, what types of resources have they included in past coverage, so that we understand if they're approaching these kinds of topics with the sort of seriousness and professionalism that really, this demands. So it's really important to look at whom else or who are they interviewing, right? Like, who are they citing in a story? Do they tend to sort of go to one side of the table, or are they providing a more well-rounded approach? Do we see any sort of political leaning in among a particular reporter, even if they call themselves a news reporter, or the news outlet that they're representing? Even when we're talking to the news side of a news outlet, it can also be really helpful to take a look at the editorial page, what types of opinion pieces do they publish, whether, from their own columnists or editorial board members or external. I'm sure many of you have written op-eds in the past and sought to publish them. There is supposed to be a clear line between the opinion side and the news side. That is absolutely not always the case, as I'm sure many of you have seen. So it's helpful just to kind of know what you're getting into. We also like to look at the social media handles of reporters, and obviously now with Threads coming on, most reporters we find are still heavily on Twitter, X, if we must call it that, are still really there and engaging in identifying sources, engaging in conversations about the topics of the days on X. And we're seeing people moving or adding threads as well, sometimes LinkedIn also for journalism. And so we want to see sort of what are the kinds of questions they're asking, what are the conversations they're participating in, what hashtags are they using, who are the organizations that they tend to go to. Reporters, like everyone else, rely on the relationships that they have, and they will go back to the well again and again, which is why, one of the sort of opportunities I think that is most exciting for you all is to really start to think about, even before you're ready to be looking to media attention on something, is to kind of start to do this research and even cultivate early relationships with reporters when you're not in a news cycle moment, but that something might come up down the road. And that helps to kind of start to build a rapport and identify yourselves as trusted resources to members of the media. Uh-oh, questions, Q&A is not functioning, it says, Sylvia says. I wonder if we need to change a setting somehow.
Yeah, I think it might not be working. She wasn't able to write questions on the Q&A, so I'm wondering if it's not working for everyone, but we've opened up the chat, so people should be able to send through questions to the chat box if the Q&A isn't working for them.
Some of the media that you get will be incoming, right? And media will want to know something that you didn't proactively reach out about. And so we wanted to just touch on how to handle media that you don't really want to engage with. You have a menu of options. If you don't think that there is a future time when you will need to have a relationship with this reporter or this outlet, you can just ignore them. You do not have to answer them. We don't necessarily recommend this because you never know when you will need to connect with a particular outlet. But we tend to work, for example, with social change nonprofits at West. And it's very rare that we need to cultivate a strong working relationship with far right press, for example. So, we can assume for many of the requests that we do get from far right press that they're not being made in good faith. And so we tend to ignore those for the clients where we're just never going to need our point of view through that lens. And that might be the case with you. If you do think that there will be an opportunity where you will need to engage with this outlet, particularly if it's local or covers the government that you're engaged with, you can send them something generic. You can send, hey, here's our 1-paragraph statement about this. Hope it's useful, right? You don't have to engage in an interview. You can give them, from your FAQs, right? You can just send your FAQs if you feel comfortable with that, and hope that that's enough for them. Reporters also have access to public records, so there's probably a lot that they can find out without you engaging. But that's what we would recommend for media that you don't want to give an interview to. You don't feel like you can really trust them, that vetting, they haven't passed that vetting, is to just share a short 1-paragraph answer that represents your statement, so they can't say that you didn't reply or that you couldn't be reached. Want to talk about these 3 strategies, and then I'll go to the chat for questions. Embargoed, exclusive, and selective release. So the case that I did last week, where the human rights organization I work with brought a suit against a nationalist white supremacist group, we did under embargo. So we found about 10 to 12 reporters who could potentially be interested, who had covered this topic or this group before. I reached out and said, I'd love to offer you information in advance of the filing. If you agree to not publish any information or share publicly this information before we file, I'm happy to give it to you. And this depends on all the reporters agreeing to the exact same time. So in our case, it was 12:01 a.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time last Tuesday, but it was very specific so that no one could claim confusion. And they all agreed to it. And all those stories that we helped facilitate in advance came out at that time, and particularly the Associated Press, which is a news wire and is run in many other outlets as sort of syndicated. And that was particularly helpful for spreading the word about our case. The trickiness with an embargo is you must be very exact in that first email or in that first contact. You must hear affirmatively, either in writing or on the phone, from the journalist. They say, I agree to your embargo. And if you have to ask them again, for clarity, does this mean you agree to the embargo? So that they answer, yes, I agree to the embargo. It's very important, because if one of them breaks the embargo, it's broken for everyone, because you've tried to give this equal advanced playing field to the people you've selected. So if, let's say, the AP ran something on Monday afternoon, I would have to call everybody who I'd offered this early access to and say, hey, the AP broke the embargo, feel free to run your story, which also would have threatened our legal approach because we didn't want the defendants knowing about the case until it was fully filed. An exclusive is best used when you do not think you can generate a lot of media interest. Pick one outlet and one reporter that you think will run a story about it, especially when you tell them they're the only ones getting early access. People can chase that story after you've made it public with your one outlet. But we tend to use the exclusive strategy when we're not sure we can get wide press coverage, but the exclusivity of it may raise the stakes on it and raise the profile and have other people interested in it. And then a selective release is just a wide release at the day you want to push out, but you leave off people that you don't necessarily care about. You don't have to spread that wide net. Like I said, we work with a lot of social change organizations, and we would not include far right, right-wing media in the United States in a lot of our outreach for that. And so those are some strategies. Let's go to the chat now that we know that that's where questions are, and see if there are any that we can answer. Sam, do you want me to take this first one?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. ¿Cómo lidiar con las narrativas negativas de la extrema derecha en sus reportajes? I think there is interpretation, so I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to answer entirely in Spanish as my second language. What is important, particularly about extreme right-wing media, is to understand how much power it has over your audience. You know, and if in fact it is reaching your audience, and that is a legitimate concern to this group, particularly if you are trying to reach legislators, you know, who are very influenced by it. When we talk about the extreme right-wing media, you cannot fight that directly, and we don't recommend you spend energy fighting that directly. So to navigate negative narratives in right-wing press, one of the first and most powerful things you can do is ignore them. If you can't ignore them because they are also the mainstream, or they have mainstream power over your audience, is that the facts are your friends. You need to stick, you know, don't sink to the level that a lot of extreme right-wing news does, where, you know, facts are not backed up, they're not established, they're not evidence-based. You know, be legalistic in this sense and stick only to facts that you can back up in your public statements. And then don't engage directly, right? You can tell another reporter, right, well, there are those who have said, right, but don't give them the dignity of a response, particularly if they're committed to a negative narrative. Direct engagement will exhaust you and you will not change the minds of people who are committed to reporting those negative narratives. Find allies in the press who are willing to tell fact-based stories, and tell fact-based stories, and let the facts speak for you. Sam, any other thoughts on extreme right-wing media?
I think you handled that really well.
Okay, excellent. Next question. How do you deal with a situation when the main media in your country do not cover a situation? Oh, Greece. I've worked with the highest Greece team on this exact problem. The national media are not covering this story in Greece. That is true. Sam, do you want to take a swing at that, or shall I? I'm happy to.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll jump in after.
Okay. Outside pressure is real. Outside pressure is real. And I think the fact that it got major coverage in foreign media is a testament. I think one of the things you can attempt to do is to not try and solicit reported coverage, but rather share opinion coverage. Submit an op-ed, which we can touch on before we wrap, that gives your perspective to the national media, and could include criticism that this has not been covered enough in national media, and explain why it's important for national media to pay attention to it. So that's my first recommendation, is create an opinion piece, and don't fight against the tide if the national media are not covering it, but call them out and say what the consequences are, to not covering.
And I think similar to an opinion piece is something we call an editorial board memo, which is a similar type of piece of collateral that you would be creating, but it basically lays out the argument essentially that you would be hoping that they would take and turn into, you know, a piece from their own perspective. So as Meredith is saying, the idea is to sort of convey what has been missing, you know, where the void is in the coverage, what the perspective is that should be there, to offer, you know, facts that they need, relevant sources that they can speak to, that kind of thing. It's meant to be sort of a starting point to opening up a broader conversation. So it's kind of like another channel or tactic through which to pitch. And the other thing I would, you know, I would think about is like national media versus local or regional media in your countries. Now, obviously, you know, international media like New York Times, BBC, CNN International, these are all really important. We know that they're often, you know, syndicated or translated, reprinted in different ways. But, you know, there's interest in getting your own national, you know, media and wire services to cover things, but also sometimes when smaller outlets take it on, which might be an easier barrier to entry for you, sometimes that will then lead to more national outlets picking things up. You know, in newsrooms, there are people whose job it is to be reading the various types of media, and of course, social and monitoring social media for what are the conversations of the day, who else is handling what and from what perspective. And that helps them identify, like, you know what, actually, we really should be handling this story. And the last piece, you know, I would say is just kind of thinking about things through the lens of, is there something that feels unique or special that you can offer? You know, like journalists are people and they want to be the first out of the gate. They're competitive. They, you know, they want to sort of win the day with the news story. And sometimes, you know, we're very cautious to use the word exclusive because that has a very specific meaning in terms of actually offering someone something that is exclusive and we're not giving to any other media. But where you can sort of pitch a story in a way that feels unique, that says to a reporter, you know, sort of professional to professional. And that's why these, like, as I was getting at a little bit earlier, trying to develop relationships with the reporters that are important to you before the terrible thing happens in Greece, will help over time lead to the attention that you're seeking to get.
Thanks, Sam. We've got a lot of questions, so we're going to keep rolling through them, then we'll get back to identifying reporters in prep. Jimena asked how we deal with authoritarian or the sorts of authoritarian governments that deny a situation. I guess I need a little bit more detail on that, because I'd want to know how the courts are influence these governments. Because if a court ruling stands, then that can sort of speak for itself. But if the authoritarian government does not listen to rules of the court, then we have a totally different challenge. Jimena, do you want to clarify a little bit?
Yeah, I was basically thinking about the Mexican president, where he's a very powerful source of information, and he's not open to discuss any wrongdoings of his government, whether migration, massacres, violence. So I think it's very difficult because he has he's the main source of information for a lot of people and has a lot of popular support. So even if you engage in any of these strategies that you've shared, it seems very difficult to actually be able to counter his narrative because he's so powerful and popular. So that was where my question was coming from. I'm not sure if I was.
Is the administration accountable to the courts in Mexico?
Well, not really. That's what I was mentioning, the authoritarian part, because he's being also in this new campaign attacking the judiciary and the courts, and he's able to get away with it because he's so popular. So that was
we've seen that in other countries, including Israel. In the United States, we do have this privilege where the court still is acting as a check on administrative power. We've seen that a little bit in the last couple of weeks. Even former administrative power, but we've seen it through lawsuits of the Biden administration, policies that they've tried to enact as well, particularly for refugees. I would say for this, you have to rethink your audience. Do not try and reach who cannot be reached. who can make a difference in your situation, in your case, right? If you're bringing the case, you're obviously invested in the courts to make a change in the situation. And so you have to see that value for what it is. And you can say that it's limited, right? You could say, even though we got this ruling in the courts, it has a limited effect. You can also look and sort of proactively do what our colleagues in Greece are experiencing and look outside, right? I don't know about AMLO, but I know that the Brazilian president, Lula da Silva, wakes up every morning and reads everything about Brazil that he can in foreign press. Matters an incredible deal to him how the New York Times is seeing Brazil on that day. So that's unfortunately a different example, but right, where international press is really important and can influence from the outside. So I wouldn't hesitate to influence from the outside, particularly because a lot of the cases being tried in Mexico are so closely tied to North American outcomes for migrants and refugees. So maybe proactively cultivate a relationship with correspondents who are in Mexico City and along in border towns, working for North American outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times, because that might be the only place to hold accountability. And AMLO might be very popular, but he still has to deal with the United States, for example, as their big brother neighbor. And so those people who make decisions on the American side are reading those papers and taking that into account. So I would say, don't try and, fight authoritarian regimes head on, try and find ways around them and through the press. And then finally, I saw Melissa Flores in the Q&A. Shout out to Al Otro Lado, which does incredible work on the border. I was really lucky to volunteer in 2019 at a workshop that they did just as Title 42 was starting. So how do you handle a reporter who broke an embargo? I would personally just blacklist them. Depends on how you need them and how the embargo got broken. So I had a close contact break an embargo by accident, right? His web people published his piece without him knowing in advance. And so I said, all right, I'm going to call everybody else and I'm going to tell them what happened. And I'm going to say it was you. So, his reputation among his peers was impacted, but I understood that it wasn't his choice to run something early. I think blacklisting is appropriate for a short amount of time. I would not maybe do it forever. You may need them again in the future. So you can just be like, hey, this really messed up our plans. This wasn't what we agreed to. I don't think we're going to be able to share anything with you for the next 6 months. Like, I'll check you in 6 months, but this has really created a huge problem for us. We had an agreement. And if you can't keep those agreements, I'm just going to have to reset our relationship for a while. So I don't think that's inappropriate. I just wouldn't make it a forever and ever amen kind of thing, because you just don't know when you need them. I worked for Senator Harry Reid, and we did, for I think it was maybe like a month, because we probably couldn't afford very long, we did blacklist the Las Vegas Review-Journal for a month because of some reporting that they did that we asked them not to do, and they agreed not to do it, and then they did it anyway. But that was all we could hold out because it was the biggest paper in the state. And so we tried to make a statement in the limited amount of time that we had. Okay. Want to make sure we cover the ground rules. Keep those questions coming. We'll have another period for Q&A. Most of you already know on the record, off the record, and on background, but we want to make sure that we say this clearly. On the record is the default position for talking with any reporter. They will always try and assume they will not clarify when things are on the record or off the record, because they want that default. They want to be able to use everything you say and attribute it to you. That's in their best interest as reporters. The most wild example I can remember from recent history is in his very short tenure as White House communications director. Anthony Scaramucci just called Ryan Lizza at the New Yorker and just talked to him. Didn't say anything about what was on and off the record. And so that whole thing got reported, and it was a wild conversation. So that's somebody who definitely should have known better. But you should all know that if you're going to engage with a reporter, they are assuming from the very moment you start talking that it's on the record. You can change that by asking for things to be off the record and hearing them agree. I agree, this is off the record. Off the record means that they can know the things, but they can't report them. They can't attribute them to you. They can just know them, which might give them an avenue to research and find out from another source that they can attribute to. But off the record only serves to educate the journalist and to keep attribution for that education away from you. I would not use this very often, particularly if you're the only one with the facts of the case. It will be obvious that you are the people this is coming from. On background is a combination sort of the two, where it says, you can know this information. You can attribute it to a source. Let's negotiate how you identify me as the source. So if you've ever seen a source close to the administration, a source close to the case, a source, in the immigration sphere, that's all on background information where the reporter can know it, can report it, and you've agreed on how it will be attributed, though not in the same way that on the record is attributed. So always set ground rules up front. It feels awkward. It doesn't make it like a normal conversation, and that's okay. Conversations with journalists are not normal. They are information sharing opportunities that will result in a public record. So make sure you have them up front. You cannot retroactively put anything off the record. So as Sam said earlier, please establish the rules about what you're about to talk about before you talk about it, and hear an affirmative agreement, either in writing or clearly from a reporter. Depending on your jurisdiction, you may be able to record the conversation that you're having with a reporter. I generally recommend that. In certain jurisdictions, you have to tell them that that's what you're doing, but I think that just shows a savvy person. Oh, hey, we're just going to record this for our notes, just so you know. I live in Washington, D.C., where it is double consent. Both people in the conversation have to know that it's being recorded. Two last things in terms of identifying the right reporters. I have done this to great success. Ask the reporter, before you talk to my client, can you tell me what your trauma-informed interview plan is? Not a lot of them have heard of that, and that's okay. But if they don't know what that is at all, or they can't like intuit what some options would be that are trauma-informed, rethink having your client talk to this person. So it sounds very formal, your trauma-informed interview plan. And most of them don't have a document that says, this is my trauma-informed interview plan. But if a reporter responds, oh yeah, I'd want to make sure that we agree they're anonymous. I won't share details about where they came from or their family members who are still in Afghanistan, for example. They know a little bit about what you're talking about. And then I think you can engage in a conversation to be like, look, they're not going to talk about their time in prison, or they're not going to talk about their time while they were in Turkey because they weren't in Turkey legally. And so you can kind of create space for your client to not answer those in advance. The journalist can still ask, but they could also know in advance that you're not going to answer. So I would suggest asking every reporter that wants to talk, particularly for television, because tears are good TV, but tears indicate that the person is perhaps being re-traumatized by this moment, what their trauma-informed interview plan is. I had an Al Jazeera reporter react very negatively and said, we don't traumatize people. And I was like, you haven't even thought about it. And I didn't let her have an interview with clients, particularly because these clients were children. So ask, see how they react. They don't have to have something as formal as a trauma-informed interview plan, but they have to know the risks that they are presenting to traumatize and re-traumatize people that you work with. And then why we're going to identify with reporters in the first place is that you want to have something to give them that goes beyond the public record. They're excellent at researching what's already public. You don't need to give them access to that unless you're having a really good relationship and it makes their life easier and you feel like you want to make it easier. Some things are public, some things they can get through a Freedom of Information Act request here in the United States or other public records laws. What can you give them that they don't already have? Usually that's access to the client and the client's story, and serves your sword or shield purpose, right? Getting the narrative or correcting the narrative. You should have this. You should have something to give them that goes beyond the public record. And if you can't, don't engage with the reporter. That's okay. And that can change throughout the course of the case. All right, before we get to messaging, do we want to take 2 more questions, Sam?
Sure. Let us quickly get up to speed on these questions. Okay, Gabriella, can you type for us if you have a specific question? This is also a helpful comment for sure. But if there's a question that we can sort of help with, Meredith, anything you want to say at this point in response to Gabriella?
No, yeah, we need a specific question.
Okay, that would
Although
help.
I do say, like, part of the reason we want our clients to engage is because to hear stories in migrants' own voices is the most valuable way we can tell these stories. So speaking in your own voice and from your own experience without being interpreted by either your lawyer or a national of that country is very powerful and important.
Yeah, agree. It sounds like the challenge here was maybe the issue that these Venezuelans had expired IDs and you were concerned about putting them out there publicly and exposing their identities, maybe. And so I guess we would just say, you know, yeah, I mean, that's a very valid concern, and you have to prioritize your client's safety above all else. So thinking back to some of the advice we shared earlier in terms of protecting their identities and you know, and that may mean that there is no opportunity for the member of the media to actually meet the person in person, because, you know, you need to be with your client at all times. Maybe you're going to do it over Zoom on audio only. You're going to change their username, you know, that sort of thing, where you're offering someone, and you're you know, what you're looking for is basically trust from the media outlet that they that you know, they are trusting you to be providing them with the type of resource that they're looking for without revealing that person's identity. And we realize this is very, I mean, this is the heart of it, right? This is very challenging. It can make it very hard to tell the story if you can't put those people forward. But as Meredith said, the human stories, for people to be able to really share the impact, you know, what's going on in their own lives is, of course, what we need. They're typically not, you're right, they're not looking for the ivory tower, as we call it, you know, sort of perspective. Thanks.
And then Dorothy's question is a little bit like Melissa's question. Reporters do on occasion violate ground rules. The repercussions kind of have to be made up by you. The more power you have, the more powerful your repercussions are. So most of us do not have as much power as institutions, for example. So you know, a repercussion that we see in Washington is that you could get your access denied by institutions like the White House or the Supreme Court, right? Your outlet could suffer a denial of access if you break these rules. Now, we are not as powerful as institutions like the White House. You can, as Melissa suggested, blacklist that reporter and not work with them again for a period of time, depending on how, you know, much you anticipate you will need them. You can make clear, you can complain. I want to say that complaining up someone's chain of command is also very important. So as excellent of a publication as the Washington Post is, there was work that their Mexico City correspondent did in which he identified and used the real voices of children who were unaccompanied and involved in smuggling operations, one of whom had a protection case pending before the United States government. And because their real names were used by this journalist, the United States denied them protection as a minor. That is an incredibly far-reaching consequence. And so I worked with the legal organization representing the minor, and we went above the reporter to his editor to say, you have secured a future for this young person who didn't have a person of the age of majority to speak for him. By identifying him and his story and his full name, you have ensured that he'll never be protected in the United States like he sought. So I just want you to know that your reporting resulted in that consequence because you talked to a child and you didn't make clear the impact that speaking with you would have. They never are obligated to make clear the impact, which is why we have to do it, right? It's up to us to talk about that, and we'll discuss that a little bit more when we get closer to prep. I know we're got about a half an hour left, but that's another option you have. It's not a powerful consequence like losing access, but if you can go above the reporter to their editor, or say even the editor-in-chief of their organization, and say, this is the damage that was done by this violation of the ground rules, this breaking of the embargo, or this positive, complete identification of somebody seeking asylum, you know, they can think twice before they do it the same way the next time. All right, Sam, talk to us about how to message.
Okay, so we're going to start with this mnemonic device that hopefully there's a clever version in each of your languages that you can come up with to help you remember. But in English, head, heart, and hand. This is the three sort of elements that make the most effective message as you are thinking about when you go into a media interview, you know, or even just an opportunity to have a conversation with a member of the media, or other non-media types of opportunities where you're conveying your message. I'm sure that many of you are storytellers and work with your clients to tell their stories in the most effective way. And remember to, you know, to be concise and to share the most compelling and most important information without sort of telling one's life story or going down a long and windy road, but really sticking to these kind of three areas. So the substance is the data, the meat, the numbers, the facts. Media absolutely need this in order, you know, especially with something in the legal world, in order to tell the story. Sometimes it has to do with statistics that paint a broader picture. If we're giving statistics, we obviously need to provide citations, the sources, you know, because they're going to need that for what they're publishing. The heart is the, you know, what the part that's going to pull at your at someone's heartstrings, the true human stories, the impact. And, you know, as we've discussed earlier, some of those elements about talking about real people, you know, in the ways that you share these stories to really demonstrate, you know, the impact of existing policy or a particular case that someone is currently involved in and how that's affecting their life, their family's lives, you know, that kind of thing. And then the hand is the ask or the call to action is another way of thinking about it. So what do we want our audiences to do with the information that we're providing them? It's kind of like, for some of you who have been part of writing op-eds before, which are persuasive pieces, we like to end, you know, we always like to end an op-ed on sort of a note that introduces something slightly new that leads the reader to say, now that I know this, you know, what do I need to do with this information? What's next? That sort of thing. So ultimately, we're trying to impact hearts and change minds in order for some sort of action to come out of, you know, our efforts here. We are trying to craft a message that matters to and really touches people. So, you know, thinking about here's why the facts, this particular situation, the historical context, these resources are important to me, why I want you to understand them, and what I want you to do with them. Again, the call to action. So kind of like the simplest way to think about this is, what do people need to know? What do we want them to feel as they learn this? And what do they need to do with it? Okay. Oh.
So I'm going to bring up another resource that we like to use and that we can share through Bella to everyone on here, which is a messaging worksheet. Before you engage in any way with a reporter, particularly in advance of an interview, we encourage you to fill this out. We make everybody do it, whether you're an amateur who's, you know, never engaged in the press before, or you're a CEO who talks to them always. This prep can be very helpful in making sure you're ready and that you've at least spent some time thinking about what you want to come out of the interaction. So this is our message worksheet. Before you go into a conversation, know what you want to get out of it. It doesn't have to be 3 things, but could be up to 3 things. If you want 4 things out of it, now you're really getting complicated. Like, slim down. What is the one thing that you want to come out of it? Why are you doing this? How does it benefit you and your sword or shield purpose? Who is your audience, right? And this goes back to Jimena's question. We're not going to change AMLO and his administration. So like, who do we really want to reach? And maybe it is foreigners. Maybe it's the refugee community itself living in Mexico. Maybe it is local officials, right? Like, if you could really change the way that people worked at the border between Mexico and Guatemala, you know, could that make an impact? And then what are your key messages? If you don't say anything else, what is the one thing that you want to be quoted as saying about your case? And we want to make sure that we're concise, pull from stuff that you've already prepared, like your holding statements and your FAQ. And I think that the way that legal arguments are structured, it like lends itself to this, is that you start with the therefore. My client deserves this. Here is the evidence, right? Instead of building up the evidence and then saying, therefore, my client deserves this. Start with the outcome that you want. Put their story into the broader narrative. Talk about the threats that have happened to migrants like them, deaths at sea that have happened. You know, put it in the context. And then again, go back to your FAQs. What do you think people are going to ask? And then you can anticipate what they might ask and put that here in your messages. So those are some ways to do your prep, especially if you're going to be the spokesperson, or to walk your client through if they are going to be the spokesperson for the interview.
And Mayor, I'll just add a couple things to keep in mind.
Please.
So yeah, the worksheet is really helpful to prepare. And then as you're doing it, just sort of doing the exercise will help you get to what we kind of often say is, if you take one thing away from this training, it's really to go into these conversations with media knowing that, like, that core message. So like 1 to 3 sentences, the main point that you absolutely are going to say, regardless of what is asked of you. It's really important to remember with interactions with media that they're looking to you as the expert on topics. They may or may not, and you'll hopefully have done your research and sort of have an idea going in of how much they may or may not know and how sort of like legally conversational they are and that sort of thing. But you're the ones who know, you know, the information that you're trying to give them. They may not even know the right questions to ask, and that's okay. It's a platform for you and for your clients to go in knowing what you're going to tell them so that you're educating them. Engagements with media are really a two-way street. It's not just about them coming to you, question, answer, right? It's really a conversation. And that's how over time you do build credibility with media, is that they look to you as someone who can help them wrap their brains around a complicated subject, and know that they can come to you to help explain something. May lead to a story where you're quoted or not, right? It may just make for a better story that raises visibility of an important issue. Mayor, do we want to talk a little bit about storytelling tips before we go on?
Particularly in the light of Jimena's comment here, do you have any tips to avoid narratives that diminish the dignity and agency of migrants and asylum seekers? I've seen campaigns and features that are too condescending and further the powerless, simplistic narrative of migrants. How would you have a conversation that they might not be aware of an inappropriate or obsolete tone of the narrative? This is part of actually being trauma informed. A huge way to accompany people who have experienced trauma is to give them many opportunities at agency. Many opportunities to speak with their voice. Now, we have to be clear about the potential downsides. And that's in the next slide I'm going to show, is like, there are downsides. Samantha and I have both worked with survivors of domestic violence, for example, to prepare them to tell their stories. Their full name, if they use it, right, and their story of domestic violence will follow them. If that's the first thing that comes up when you Google their name, it means a potential employer will know their story. It means a potential romantic partner will know their story. Their children, as they grow up, can learn their story. So we have to be really clear about the downsides, but giving them an opportunity to affirmatively say, yes, I want to tell my story. Yes, I want to put, the details out there. People need to hear what I've decided, why I decided, etc. That can be hugely healing for people who have experienced a deprivation of agency, who haven't been given choices, is for us to give them choices to engage or not. So Sam, talk a little bit, about how storytelling does that, gives us an opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So another thing we suggest that you practice, in addition to identifying your core message and the supporting message and any data points that you want to bring to the table, statistics, numbers, figures, that sort of thing, is sort of what is the story that you, or, as you work with clients, that they're trying to tell, so that people are able to be their most authentic selves in these conversations as they share their experiences. I was actually just with a client in a different state this week, which is an early childhood program that has a teacher who immigrated from Venezuela 9 years ago. And the school has really, she fled, violence there. And the school has really helped her establish her life in the United States, find housing, find a job, feel a sense of stability. And if we hadn't practiced her storytelling before she actually was exposed to media interviews yesterday, I guarantee you she would have been sobbing her way through those interviews, because that was what happened the first time we sat down to talk through her experience and for her to share her story with me in a private setting around a coffee table, because it was the first time she'd really sort of like put herself out there vulnerably and talked through and thought through the impact of this particular organization on her life, and thinking back to her life in Venezuela and the family she left behind and all of that. So you never want the engagement with a member of the media to be the first time that someone is sort of asked to, hey, tell me about your experience and what your life is like now. It is really important to do some of that practice. So kind of basic storytelling best practices as you and your clients kind of craft a narrative that's really going to connect with the audiences whom you're speaking to, and share compelling elements of one's past and one's present and hopes for the future. Things like thinking about the beginning, the middle, and the end. So really telling a story, it's going to be short, but it starts somewhere, something happens in the middle, and either something has happened and concluded, or we're hoping for something to happen, in the end, or there's a danger that may be ahead of us, a risk, something like that, that really points to the future and what we're anticipating. We talked a little bit earlier about naming your characters, of course, where possible, where safe, or finding some means of humanizing and identifying the different people who are kind of the characters in the story. We also call this showing rather than telling. So telling is where you're sort of like talking at a high level, very like explanatory in a way that doesn't feel illustrative. It's like explanations more than specific examples. Like I would say, like, even throughout this training, you've seen Meredith and me sort of both refer to like specific other trainings we've done, or clients we've worked with, individuals we've talked to. That's really the showing element that kind of brings the story to life. Sensory details, so things like words, language that will help your audience see, hear, really imagine the moment you're describing. Anecdotes, don't shy away from emotion. These subjects that we're talking about here are intense and life-altering, life-changing, life-saving. There are always going to be reasons to be concerned as well as reasons to be hopeful. And we want to give our audience both, so that they walk out of this with, again, understanding what is that call to action and what might be a particular audience member's role there. I think that's it. Maybe we'll pause for any more. Yeah, this will be a good point to pause for more questions if anyone has any. Let's see. No, I don't see any that have popped up.
Okay, I'm going to go on to talk some specifics about preparation, which we already sort of talked about. There is a theory for medicine and medical procedures that is called informed consent. You can't consent to a surgery unless you know all the potential outcomes, how the surgery will benefit you, how the surgery could impact you negatively going forward. Fortunately for us here in the United States, informed consent is part of the law, and people have to be given the opportunity to make an informed decision about their health care. And I would like us to use this theory of informed consent when we present opportunities for interview, or we even open up the topic, would you like to talk to a journalist, in the same way. We need to outline the upsides. Your story can help us win in the court of public opinion and gather support for more people like you. You can help others in similar situation, because when we share your details, both in the press and in court, we're going to set precedent. We can help get you support after whatever happens in the courts. We can get you scholarships and grants and support because you've been able to tell your story publicly. We might even be able to elevate this to a whole nother level of governance. There are rights, complaints, methods that you can use in the UN system. Say you don't get any remedy from your national government, you can elevate your case to the Human Rights Council. You can elevate your case to UNHCR for its opinion. And so sharing your story could have all these upsides, and it could have all these downsides. It could be dangerous for you to be identified and associated with people left behind. You will have permanent association with this story. You will perhaps, especially if you use your full name and identifying details, never be able to separate yourself from the story that we are telling, because the internet is forever. Could hurt your hireability. Everyone would know that you are a refugee whose case was presented in court, and that could discourage certain employers. Could affect your personal relationship, and it could even expose you to further cases down the line. So we want to make really clear the downsides as well, because then someone really is informed enough to make a consent decision about participating in an interview. We also want to make sure that we're trauma informed, and I assume that you all are, particularly in legal cases, but decide upfront what's off the table. So when Sam and I worked with domestic violence survivors, a lot of them said, I don't want to talk about my kids at all. And so we came up with a stock answer, so that if a reporter says, so tell me about your kids, you'd be like, I don't think we should discuss my kids. That's it. That's the answer. You can quote me saying, I don't think we should discuss my kids. What's essential to understand, right? Particularly for people who are going through a legal process, like refugees, they are put in situations where they have to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, beginning to end, all the details, all the time, right? So that they're believed and given the status that they need to be protected. Journalists don't need all that. Journalists need the beginning, the middle, and where we are now, and the hope for the end. So helping narrow down the details. What are the 4 essential details for understanding how we got here? The 5 essential details, so that we don't end up making our interviews feel like a police or a UNHCR credible fear interview. We don't want to do that. We want to give people space to process. So we want to prep with them well in advance of an interview, give them some space to think about it. We want to talk about how we're going to answer questions we don't want to answer, more on that next. And we want to sit in on interviews. I'm sure lawyers are used to doing this. We are also used to doing this as public relations professionals, so we can interrupt anything that's harmful. So I was sitting with the mother of a domestic violence victim, someone who did not survive her relationship. And on the 3rd time that the journalist said, but you didn't see any signs that she was in an abusive relationship, I interrupted and I said, this is the 3rd time you've asked this question. I'm pretty sure that this person's mother has told you that she didn't see any signs. I think you need to take her word for it. And he didn't ask that question again. And he didn't quote me either, because that wasn't really an interesting, part of the story. So we want to be able to protect people, in the event that journalists don't turn out to be what we thought they were. Although again, as Sam said, that vetting, that really looking into, can establish sort of that safety in advance. And then people don't have to read their stories or watch their stories, right? That also has a traumatic implication. We can read them and look at them and review them and say, hey, that went really great. I think it's going to play out like this. So they don't have to relive them. And letting them know when stories are going to come out. That's part of our job as public relations professionals, to say, this is going to be published on Tuesday. What are your plans on Tuesday? Who can be with you on Tuesday? Don't be alone on Tuesday, because this might impact you. Looking at the chat. Oh, great. Okay. Pivoting and bridging. Sandra,
Okay,
let
so
those-
I know we only have a few minutes left and we do want to try to take a couple questions. So we're going to go through this real quick and you guys can look at the deck later. But essentially, these are just some tips to think about how to shift the conversation away from topics, questions you may get that you're not the most appropriate person to answer, that are inappropriate questions that you just don't want to deal with. So we like to say, acknowledge the question. So, don't just ignore it and change the subject, but say, that's a good point, or I understand why you may be wondering about that. Bridging is then the transition phase where you say something like, and we're going to share a list of such common phrases you can sort of put in your back pocket, but say something like, but what I really want to talk to you about, or the reason I'm here today, or the reason you called me is because I'm an expert in X, right? Like, there might be someone else that makes sense to talk to about why. And you know what? If you know the right person, if there actually is someone that comes to mind that you can provide a connection to the journalist to sort of serve in that role as giving them another source that might be more appropriate for a particular element of the conversation, that's really great. That really sort of elevates your credibility as a whole for everything else you've shared with them, to be able to say, like, this isn't my area of expertise. And then you get back to your core message. You sort of rechannel the conversation. This sort of thing is not media 101. This is media 301. This takes practice. So we would encourage you, as you're talking to your colleagues who are able to, who with whom you can talk openly about a case, family members with whom you may not be able to talk as openly about a case, family members, friends, which might be more akin to what a media conversation might look like. Practice this type of thing. Have people sort of grill you with some of the tough questions that you might get. Actually anticipate those questions in advance. Write them down. Think about, if you were a member of the media, what would you want to know? What are the juicy or complicated details? And then actually practice how you would answer and get back to your main points. So this is an example of a pivoting and bridging. We're going to keep moving so Meredith can quickly address the next topic.
So these are just a few things. If it does end up being TV, we'll just leave these here, but there are some things you really want to be cognizant of. Like turning off your phone, not wearing stripes that are going to conflict with the way cameras work. Avoid, a lot of us, because particularly when we're in conversation, we'll start our response to somebody by saying, "Oh yeah," or "Yes." But in an interview that is like agreeing with the premise of the question, which we might not always want to do. And then just remembering your own expertise. Yeah, and don't swivel in your chair. It's very distracting on TV. So I'll stop sharing here.